turn it over to you.
Sure. So hi, everybody. It's nice to see all of you. It's very exciting for me to meet this group. I hear only excellent things from Gabriella and Milton and have been very enriched personally by the Weal group meetings in New York in my time at Commonweal. So it's really great to see the Weal in its Midwest manifestation. And I hear that a couple weeks ago, some of you at least had a really good conversation with Melody G, who's actually one of the writers I work with at Commonweal. And I wish I could have been with you. I actually usually teach a class adjunct on Monday nights from 7 to 10 East Coast time, which has been, as you can imagine, for all of you who are teachers, I'm sure some of you are, quite the adjustment. So I wasn't able to be on the other virtual call to see Melody, but I heard you guys had a great conversation, and she was so pleased to be able to meet all of you as well and really enriched by your discussion and questions. So it's great for me to be here with you tonight as well. Gabriella is sending out the readings tonight. If you managed to look at them, great. If you didn't, totally fine. I thought I would just start by talking for about probably no more than 15 minutes about some of what I've been considering in the past couple of weeks on this topic of spirituality in solitude or in isolation. And then I actually have just a couple of slides just with some quotes from these readings that I thought might get our minds moving in terms of what we say about them or how we apply what they say to our own sort of spiritual experience right now. And I'm also, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No.
I meant to do this earlier and Peter reminded me, so thank you, Peter.
Oh, sure.
We had talked about doing like very bare bones ground rules for the Zoom meetings, just
Sure.
Simple things so that everybody's following along. First thing is like muting your mic when you're not speaking, things like that, just out of courtesy for everybody, and to make sure that we can hear each other. A couple of other things is please do check the chat box. I like to have mine open as we're having the call just because people will share links or quotes, and it's useful. And I don't think that'll be a problem for us today, but just having your video on while you're speaking is helpful. Sorry, should have done that earlier, my bad.
No, that's just fine. Thank you for doing that. The mute thing is especially helpful. I feel like somehow every time I come on a Zoom call, I either forget to mute or unmute still. You would think I had figured it out after 6 weeks of working from home, but in addition to talking about these readings, I'll also share briefly with you some resources at Commonweal, some of the spiritual writing we've done in the past couple of weeks that I found helpful, including a piece by Griffin, who's here on the call with us. So maybe we'll hear from him a little bit later about his process of writing that piece if he wants to share. So to sort of give us some starting ground for our discussion, I wanted to lead a conversation about spirituality and solitude and isolation because I have felt like in these past 5 or 6 weeks that I've been at home, there should be nothing easier for me to do than to be contemplative. I mean, God has basically handed us the perfect conditions in some ways to be contemplative. And what do I mean by that? Well, we're all forced, obviously, to be still, to be isolated. My calendar has been completely cleared of all of its normal obligations. It should be easier than ever, right? To find time to pray or read scripture or journal or do all of the sort of new and inventive things that we use to encounter God, right? So I have a friend right now who is drawing her prayers to God. I have had friends that are using walks as their time to connect with God and the practice of observing and noticing spring sort of coming to life around them. So both in terms of the logistics of prayer, which to be honest with you, I often find the most difficult. I am a person that thrives on busyness. I thrive on seeing others. I can very easily fill my days with things other than contemplation or time in the Word. But I also think that I have this sense that it should be easiest right now to be in touch with God, to be in touch with the Holy Spirit, because everything is so felt right now. Everyone around me is contemplating death or grief or loss or precarity in some way, whether they're a Christian or not. People are also finding hope and joy in sort of the things that Christians have been advocating for a long time, right? selfless devotion to others, making sacrifices, whether that's wearing a mask or staying in your house, the routines of domestic life or family life, the joys of nature. Basically, we're just supposed to find joy and hope now in things that are very separate from consumption or activity or achievement or ambition. And part of me thinks, Kate, this is what you've been saying or advocating for as a Christian your whole adult life, that we're supposed to be contemplating mortality. We're supposed to be thinking about the other. We're supposed to be setting aside time to pray, whether that's aloud or writing or with others. And what a gift to get to do that all during Lent and during Eastertide, which we all have just experienced or been experiencing. In a way, I think, God, could you have created better conditions for me to come closer to you, especially in the absence of communal gatherings for worship. So when we can't go to Mass, when we can't take the sacraments, we should be able, again, to come to depend more on our interior individual practices of worship. But I have to say that has not been the case for me, and I don't know how it's been for you. But what this period of weeks has been for me truly is an indictment of what my intentions are when I actually have the time to do something. So in a normal work week at Commonweal, I would say, if I didn't have such a long commute from Connecticut, I would wake up every morning and I would pray the Psalms and I would have my cup of coffee, and that's what I would do. Of course, now I actually have the time to do that. I don't even have to put on, as some of us were saying at the beginning of this call, a real outfit. And yet it's been extremely difficult for me to carve out contemplative time for prayer and worship, even as I have found myself feeling deeply, as I found myself, as I'm sure many of you have, experiencing deep grief, experiencing anger, rage, really, experiencing surprising joy. And so why is that? I'm interested to hear from you all later about, perhaps some of you have found it very easy to connect and commune with God during this time. Perhaps some of you, like me, have found it difficult. I think one of the reasons why it's been difficult for me has to do with our conversation tonight. It's that so often I encounter God and sense the Holy Spirit through other people, through my friendships, through my family members. I live far away from my family. I'm from the West Coast, but we have some local family that we're able to see and have dinner with. My colleagues at Commonweal, as corny as it is to say, because 3 of them are here, what a gift it is to go and work somewhere every day where people will pray with you and will support you in times of trial and really be the Holy Spirit to you. Hard to do that, even with great tools like Zoom. And of course, the people we worship with in our congregations, right? Or the people we're engaged in public service with or advocacy with, without those people tangibly ministering to me and without opportunities to really minister to them. I mean, yes, I can stay at home, I can wear a mask, but there's no way I can sit and have an in-person conversation with Griffin over dinner, or there's no way I can help, I don't know, Gabriella move boxes downstairs for some event that she's putting on, right? So maybe that's part of it. Maybe that it's difficult for us to experience communion when we're by ourselves. That would make sense. And maybe it's also too that solitude can turn into a felt spiritual isolation, a feeling of abandonment or panic, or this deep loneliness that Jill Lepore talks about in her piece. And so I found it just takes really real creativity and spiritual discipline to feel part of a community right now. Yes, there's tuning into a live stream service, there's coming to groups like this, but really takes for me a sort of repeated mantra in my mind almost of you're not alone, you're part of a community, there are people that know you and love you, you cross their mind each day as others cross your mind in this time. But it's work in a way that it isn't usually. And I think the second thing that I've been reflecting on in terms of, why is it so hard for me to feel like I have community, is that even though we worship a triune God, a God who embodies community, I've come to realize I don't often think of God and the Spirit or Jesus that way. When I pray, I feel like I'm often relating to one member of the Trinity rather than all of them in relationship. And so for me, I've been thinking, what would it mean to think of God's self, as actually a community that I'm a part of all the time, that's with me, that I can speak to, that I can have accountability with, that I can have fellowship with. And obviously it's different than having fellowship with friends or with family or with coworkers. No one would say that it isn't, but I do think that this time has been a call for me to experience the relationality of God in a way that I haven't before. And so with that, I'm gonna try to share my screen here. So I'm just gonna walk through the readings for today really quickly, and then and then bring in a couple of these other readings I mentioned as well. And we don't have to go back and reference them. We can talk about some or all of them later in the conversation, but maybe this will just remind those of us who had a chance to read what they were about. And if you didn't have a chance to read, this should provide a pretty good gist if you want to reference these ideas. So this Joe Lepore piece in the New Yorker, I thought was really profound and actually kind of sad. It doesn't have the sort of spiritual silver lining, I would say, this Christian hope that a lot of these other pieces we're reading have for obvious reasons. But Joe Lepore's argument is basically an evolutionary one, at least at the start. She says that people are designed to want to be part of a tribe, that we get very anxious when we're outside of our known social groups. She starts with these observations of chimps in zoos who are grieving when their friends die. It's actually, we just finished watching Tiger King yesterday, and the last scene of that show is our two chimps who are embracing each other after being apart in cages, so it felt sort of pop culture topical. But Lepore's point is that not only is it, it is evolutionary advantageous for us to be together, it's emotionally advantageous, but that all kinds of things have created the conditions for that not to be true anymore. So she talks about capitalism and secularism. She talks about declining birth rates and divorce, and elderly people more often living alone than with family, all kinds of sociological patterns that we're all familiar with. And her point is that now more than 1 in 4 people lives alone in the United States. And you get the sense that she doesn't necessarily think that's a bad thing. She says that solitude and seclusion, especially as a writer, are things she covet. And I think a lot of us might feel the same way. If we're creative in any way, if we're artists, or if we are, naturally introverted or meditative in a way, we crave actually solitude and seclusion. And if we live alone, it's not a problem for us. But she says loneliness is different than that. It's this sort of profound distress. It's isolating in that you think that no one else feels the way you do. It's isolating in that you feel ashamed to be lonely. And so she says that technology insidiously says you can always be connected. You can be at home anywhere. You never have to be lonely. But actually, she says the internet is just sort of a poor stand-in for a social safety net that used to just exist in communities. Probably her most interesting point for me was that she said that loneliness didn't really exist before the 19th century, which I don't know if that's true or not. This is sort of a compendium of books that she's reviewing in this article. But this one author says loneliness didn't exist in the way we think of it now because it was impossible to live in a community without being bonded to other people by loyalty and obligation and necessity in daily life. And that when that wasn't required anymore to have a thriving life, to eat, to raise your kids, to be safe, we started to experience loneliness, which was something that was not only common, but that we felt deep shame about. And maybe that's something we'll return to in our conversation later. What it means to be ashamed when we feel lonely or isolated, how that can feel like a personal failing rather than the failure of a system or the failure of a community to support us. So that's Joe Lepore. Before we get to the other reading that was assigned, the Timothy Radcliffe, I'll send these links as soon as I'm done talking and you guys are chatting. But, in light of this Joe Lepore piece, which treats loneliness and solitude as this sort of inevitable condition of modern life, and particularly, obviously, an inevitable condition of life right now, I wanted to turn to some of our resources and look for other ways of interpreting loneliness and isolation. And one of the richest sources for me has been this series of Lenten Homilies by our publisher, Tom Baker. And these went up every Sunday, I think from March 23rd or something like that, all the way through last Sunday. And what Tom does is essentially try to use the story of the Passion to speak about how we can feel close to Jesus, even when we feel very separate from the tangible instantiations of his love. So in the first homily, he discusses healings and resurrections, the story of the blind man being healed, the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead, women at the well. And he says that all of these miracles were actually very difficult transitions and transformations for the people involved and for the people observing them too, for the disciples. People didn't know what to make of such change. And he says that we can think about this time alone the same way. We somehow want new life to come out of it, but where it comes from is not always easy to see. I'm interested to hear from you guys later what kinds of fruit you're seeing in your own life, what sort of change you're seeing right now, and how that looks different than the fruit of the Spirit we're called to produce when life is more normal. But Tom also talks about Jesus's intimacy with us. In this second piece, Refuge of Love, he talks about Jesus's love for his friends, Lazarus and Mary and Martha, how we see them having dinner parties together in the weeks before Jesus's death. And that the relationship that Christ has with them is just particularly intimate and something we can understand. We can understand it when it's embodied in that way, and think about God coming to us in those same kind of friendly interactions, even when we're in our homes. And then this next one, The World at Its Worst, was Tom's sort of Holy Thursday homily. And he said, it seems like right now the last thing we need is a story with so much suffering and death, but Holy Week exists to show us our God at work, not supervising all this suffering from a distance, but totally immersed in it. So again, that a community exists through time and space with God, with Jesus, in the midst of this suffering. Again, I think pushing back against the idea of being abandoned and alone and isolated, as many of us, even who are Christians, feel, absent from God, questioning God about why this is happening in this way. Tom's argument is that it's just a part of the Christian story continuing. And then this last piece came up after Easter. And I think this is probably the one that's most relevant to our conversation tonight. Tom asks how we're supposed to make our Easter duty in a year where there's nowhere to go and nothing to do. I don't know if any of you felt this way, but I was like, with nowhere to dress up for and go on Easter, what do I do? How do I make sure I did it right? How do I make sure I was pious enough? How do I make sure that I worshiped the right way? Really hard to do that outside of community or to feel like you checked your box. And so Tom says, what we have to do is look around us on a quiet Easter morning and remember the signs of that risen future. Who are the people who show us what this life will be like, and where are the rejected of the world cared for? So just thinking about our obligations, our spiritual duties in a different and meaningful way. And then that brings us to Griffin's piece, which I'll touch on really quickly. Another great resource that I'll send the link around for. Griffin, do you want me to talk about it, or would you rather talk about it? Me? So Griffin wrote a meditation on sort of monastic practice and solitude. And his piece is full of all kinds of just fascinating details about this community that he was part of in Camaldoli. I don't think the piece mentions anymore that you were part of the community, Griffin, but one gets the sense that you're familiar with it. Talks about the architecture of a cell. It talks about the text of the rule in the Camaldoli's tradition. But even more so, what Griffin gets at is this idea that being isolated is not about being selfish. This first quote sort of summarizes it well. Mention the desire to be a hermit or speak about the advantages of solitude. Many respond with puzzlement. Why cast the world aside when it's so good and there's so much good to be done? Reclusion is an eccentricity at odds with what we take to be healthy human flourishing, threatens our individual freedom and turns a blind eye to the welfare of our neighbors. But, I'm going to say it wrong, Griffin, Romuald?
It's Romuald.
Romwald.
Yeah,
Oh, it's even better.
his name is Romualdo, but Romuald.
Romwald and the Camaldolese tradition don't see it that way. The monastic vocation is by definition paradoxical. The monk seeks union with God in solitude, but also relies on the wider community for material and spiritual support. So at the beginning of this piece, Griffin is struggling in a way that I found very relatable with sort of the joy, in a strange way, of his own solitude, that as long as he finds ways to not panic, as long as he stays off the New York Times constantly refreshing feed of disaster, which is a problem I have as well, and prays or goes for walks outside or calls friends, he actually, can find some peace there. And he says, but is that selfish? Is the desire to be in solitude and to be praying, can it have greater advantages for the community? And his answer is yes. And he provides several examples of monks who, preserved intellectual traditions or mapped the world or served patients in hospitals. But also that solitude and isolation frees people to pray, which as Christians we have to believe really does matter, really is work, to give their money, to give their time, to be exceptionally generous, that solitude can actually be not something we just do for our own pleasure or because we want to retreat from things that are hard, but it can be an act of really coming to grips with a world in pain and feeling oneself to be a part of it. He says here it's a pattern like breathing that reveals the presence of the Spirit. So I thought that was a really helpful way to think about solitude as well, and would recommend the piece to you guys. So I'm about to wrap up here. The last piece I'll mention, and the only other one that was on the reading list, so feel no pressure to mention Tom's pieces or Griffin's as we chat, but is Timothy Radcliffe's piece, Living in Isolation, which is one of the first things we published about coronavirus. And Radcliffe writes that isolation saps our humanity. This is really beautiful phrase. We're touched into life by each other, from tiny touches to making love. But as Christians, we believe all our loneliness is embraced in a communion that pierces every barricade. The risen Lord comes through the locked door, behind which the disciples had placed themselves in self-isolation, and lifts their fear and loneliness. So Timothy Radcliffe walks through Jesus's loneliness and Jesus's isolation, deserted by his friends, trapped in a tomb, his life sold by a betrayer. And yet, even in the midst of this abandonment, even as he knows it's happening, he's sitting at a table, offering his body and his blood and washing the feet of his disciples. Which brings Radcliffe to a point sort of similar to the one Griffin makes, if God had a different way. Millions of us endure isolation. What are the gestures we can make that put us in touch with those whom we cannot touch? How can we be offering ourselves as Jesus did, even when we feel completely depleted, as I have many days, by being so alone and so afraid and so angry? What are those small tasks that are set before us that are very different from our tasks in a different time? I don't want to say in a normal time anymore, because this might be normal for a while. So maybe it's time to learn how to deal with that. So that's all for me. I'm gonna get out of the screen share here, and come back to all of you. I mean, hopefully I don't have to do too much talking now for the rest of our time together. But I guess to get us started, some of the questions I wrote down include, any reflections you have on these readings or on any of the other readings you've placed in the chat. Any particular challenges you've had in your spiritual life right now, or any helpful practices, any really concrete tips for all of us to feel intimate with God and close to God. And then just like any reflections on what's God's teaching you right now, how you feel yourself to be bearing fruit, or what you feel to just be insurmountably challenging about what God's teaching you right now. So anywhere anyone wants to start, let's just talk.